1 Satoshi, 2 Satoshis, 3 Satoshis. Okay, thank you, everyone. Since we've had that great introduction, I don't think that we're going to need to introduce ourselves. First off, how many people here are aware of what Bitcoin is, how it works? Oh, good. Excellent. And how many of you actually own some Bitcoin? Okay, so maybe about 12 people, so actually a bit overrepresentative, I think. So we have some good questions here today, and I'm going to be taking your questions as well. So be sure to use the pigeonhole system. So just so we get a very quick overview of what we're going to be discussing here today. Bitcoin is thought of as being one of the most disruptive innovations to the financial system that's come about ever. If you look at finance, it goes back several hundred years. You can study history of Knights Templar as far as international banking. But the current financial system really hasn't had innovation in a very long time. And in the past 5 years, since Satoshi Nakamoto created Bitcoin, whoever they may be or he may be, we've seen tremendous advances, and it seems like every week we're having new advances in this space. So today on the Bitcoin panel, we have a combination of startups and an investor as well to get his opinion. So why don't we just get right into it then and start talking about being a startup in the space and what it is that attracted you to Bitcoin to start with. So why don't we start at the end here with Robert, and we'll work our way back in.
Hello? Yeah. So, I mean, I think my background is mathematics and computer science, so I was clearly initially fascinated that cryptography was being proposed to solve some interesting problems, guaranteed scarcity, no duplication, etc. So that was kind of an initial interest. I think, you know, candidly, what got Bitcoin, for good or for bad, very much under my radar screen was having lived in 22 years in Tokyo and very aware of financial developments. I really had never heard of Mt. Gox at all before it spectacularly hit the headlines around the world, and that really got me looking at things. I've got a number of different investments, you know, sort of full disclosure. I would certainly not hold myself out as a Bitcoin expert, nor do I have any investments directly related to Bitcoin. About the closest I would come is investing in a fund that uses peer-to-peer lending as the underlying investment instrument. So obviously also a longtime financial services person. I'm very interested and concerned, if you will, about where that industry may be going and what disruptions may be coming forward.
Hi, I first got involved with Bitcoin maybe a year and a half ago, where I tried to pitch it to my team at Credit Suisse. I thought it was a fantastic idea. It took me a very long time to understand it. The quality of information back then was probably about 2% of what it is now. Now you can go online, search for Bitcoin, and get hundreds of thousands of results, and they're great forums and bulletin boards, and you can really, it's very, very well explained and articulated. Back then it wasn't, so it took me a while to understand. But the fundamental principle that got me really intrigued by this was the way Bitcoin solved this problem that had never been solved before, which is the tracking of unique digital assets from one person to another without needing a centralized ledger controlled by one entity, like you would do with your finances in a bank account held by a bank. So this was the proposal for the very first time, where you had a public ledger, so everyone could see who owned what, and this solved a problem which I don't think had ever been, which previously had been thought impossible to solve. So that's what got my attention. I tried to buy some coins. I find it very, very difficult indeed. Being a British person living in Singapore, And I think the only exchange you could buy coins from was Mt. Gox, which was in Japan, and you needed US dollars with which to buy them, and it was very opaque. Nowadays, there are many, many more exchanges. We've got people here representing one in the Philippines, myself from itBit in Singapore. At itBit, you can buy coins with Singapore dollars, euros, and US dollars, and there are probably about 20 exchanges globally that of varying standards. So it's much, much easier to buy now. I also like the underdog. You know, I think that finance at the moment is broken. It's very hard to make certain types of payments around the world. I tried to make a payment to a hotel in India, and it took 2 weeks, and it came through funny. They thought it when they looked in their bank account, it came through as a check rather than a bank wire, which is what I initiated, and it cost about $50, including fees and exchange rate slippage. With Bitcoin, they could have got that money almost instantly, almost for free. So I think there's a lot of space for Bitcoin to transform the way international trade is done.
Thank you, David. I would correct you there. There's been an innovation in financial system that started about 100 years ago and was concluded in 71, which is fiat money. Unfortunately, it is a very negative innovation, so we're trying to reverse the trend. My interest in Bitcoin comes from my economics background, and I see current financial system as completely broken because it creates the inflation which transfers wealth from the poor and from the middle class to the wealthiest. It creates bubbles, malinvestments, crises. It distorts incentives and introduces the moral hazard by providing implicit or explicit bailout guarantees, and last but not least, it allows governments to grow beyond their means because it gives them the ultimate power of money printing. Bitcoin, by its very design, is opposed to this. Like gold, it cannot be controlled. It's scarce, but unlike gold, it is much easier to transfer, and it provides all this functionality that Antony mentioned. Like transfer of information and the public ledger and the asset tracking and so on. So this is where I come from.
So I spent a couple of years investing into early stage companies in Silicon Valley, and I guess I saw Bitcoin the first time a couple of years ago when people started coming in and pitching ideas, and actually kind of ignored it. It seemed like a marginal thing, and it wasn't a very clear use case. So one of the things I like to do outside of investing is travel. And about 2 years ago, I took a few months to travel throughout Southeast Asia. And then I noticed something else that was very interesting. I got outside of the cities and I got into some remote areas. And most people didn't have access to running water, electricity, very few items to buy. But the thing that was almost identical everywhere I went is everybody had cell phones. And everybody would ask to add me on Facebook when I left. And then I kind of realized the world is changing around us. We're at an inflection point, and large groups of population that don't have access to very basic services, healthcare, education, banking, commerce, are now addressable, and they're addressable through technology. And that's kind of where I looped back into Bitcoin, because I realized I have a perfect technology to provide this population with banking services, low-cost banking services. So my interest in Bitcoin is actually not so much in the technology side, but in the fact that it enables people to do something they can't do before. So in this example, it's paying for something online when you don't have a credit card. For those of you who don't know, credit card penetration in Southeast Asia is still less than 5%. In the Philippines, less than 3%. Sending money to your relatives. The average payment, the average percentage for remitting money to your family abroad is around 9%. In the Philippines, there's $24.7 billion flowing in every year. And the reason that people have to pay that 9% is because they don't have access to a bank account. So Bitcoin for me became interesting as a means to solve a problem, more so than a technology.
Okay. So I know a few of you come from former startups. Ron, you were saying that you come from an investment banking background as well as startup background. So what surprised you about going into the Bitcoin space? Is anything, you've probably dealt with issues before with startups. Is there anything unique to Bitcoin?
I can take that. So I've come from a investment banking background. So from what I hear, so the only startup I know is itBit. But from what I hear, other startups don't have the challenges of, can you open a bank account? This is one of the biggest challenges that Bitcoin companies have, and I hear if you do a startup, if you want to build a chain of coffee shops, or if you want to do some manufacturing, it's very easy to get a bank account, and the regulations are very clear around what you can and can't do. I think they're the two single biggest challenges as a Bitcoin startup. Banks, for their own good reasons, aren't particularly comfortable with working with Bitcoin companies, even though the risks I would consider the risks to be very low. A lot of Bitcoin companies aren't asking for loans or anything traditionally considered as financially risky. There's some reputational impact, but that's one of the big challenges that all Bitcoin companies have seen over the past year. Someone else?
I'm constantly surprised by our customers. So Bitcoin is incredibly difficult to use, and it's really complicated and scary. I think, for me, it kind of like reminds me of when I got on the internet the first time, and I had to actually, put a card into my computer, configure things, connect. It was just a nightmare. But our customers are actually not tech savvy. A lot of them are just really anxious to solve a problem. And we get people who would, I don't even know how they figure out how to use Bitcoin. It's just that the problem is so painful that they are figuring out how to tie in, sticks and stones to make hammers. It's incredible.
I've got a story in this one. We had a customer who was trying to buy Bitcoin on our platform, who hadn't ever used internet banking before. So we had to teach them how to use internet banking with their Singapore bank before they could make a payment from their bank account to our bank account. So the interest is definitely there, and people do want to use this. I thought that email and internet banking came first before looking at Bitcoin, but that's not always the case.
Yeah, it's also the cut of society. So we started off having very large transactions, so speculators, etc. But now we're getting a lot of lower amount transactions. I think we had one sell order on the site for 6 pesos, which is I think less than 25 US cents.
Tomas, do you have any opinion on?
Not really. This is my pretty much first startup. I tried something shortly before that, so there's not much that can surprise me. I expected the resilient or the reluctance of the banking sector to deal with Bitcoin, because this is against their fundamental way how they make business, which is by printing money. So I'm not surprised by them not being particularly friendly to that. Other than that, I don't think there's much I can add.
Okay, so you guys brought up regulations and dealing with the potential of regulations. So as a startup, most startups don't have to deal with the fact that their business could be deemed high risk in the future and therefore come under regulations. You're just busy building the business, getting customers, making sales. So as a business person, as an investor, how do you deal with the current state of regulations and also the threat of future regulations? Maybe Robert will start.
Okay, yeah, maybe I'll just kind of comment a little bit, sort of financial services view in. I think it's probably useful to think about Bitcoin in small denominations and large denominations quite a bit differently, right? And I think your analog for Bitcoin in a small denomination really should be cash, right? Theoretically, cash has some regulation around it, but the reality is it's very weakly controlled or regulated, right? We don't know where we got our cash from, where it's gone to. In some cases, we may even not know whether it's real or not, right? And it works perfectly well for small denomination transactions, and I can see there's a tremendous demand there. Once you get into larger transaction sizes, you're going to interact with all kinds of things that are going to attract the interest of governments around the world. So you look at the sanctions against Russia around Ukraine, right? The approach there is not to use troops, but to block financial transactions. Therefore, if you have large financial transactions, the U.S. government is going to have a very, very strong interest to be able to block them. So you certainly should want to structure business to stay away from that space or to solve that problem directly, right? I think the other good analog would be BNP, $10 billion sanction, right? Very few businesses could survive that kind of a sanction where, once again, blocking transactions, taxation, and regulation are the three places that naturally would hit a large financial transaction. I think the interesting question is there a way to stay in the small transaction space and be fine? Or is there a way to take on directly the identity questions and other issues that come up?
Tomas, you want to?
Well, I deal with potential future regulations by fighting them as much as possible, by publicly speaking and writing against them, because regulations are usually written by or designed together by government officials or bureaucrats who are trying to increase their power, by existing industry players who are trying to maintain their market share at the expense of the new competition, or in the worst case, their customers, or by lawyers, as David puts it very nicely, who are trying to get more fees from advising on those regulations. And even if those regulations are introduced and designed with the best of intentions, they always introduce some unintended consequences, which free market usually deals with much more quickly and much more decisively. So the best regulation at the end of the day is the goodwill of the entrepreneur and his voluntary relationship with his customer and his urge to maintain or increase his market share on the free market by providing better and cheaper services. As for future existing regulations, I have to deal with them by unfortunately following them, or I will have to, because it would be very difficult to serve my customers from jail.
I have the exact opposite view, by the way. So I think if government wants to kill Bitcoin, the best way to do it is by not regulating Bitcoin. Regulation increases trust, and when you're dealing with currency, trust is the most important factor. What we give our customers is the trust that they can always convert their coin back to cash.
Yeah, but you don't do that because of regulations. You do that because you want their trust. You want more customers by providing good service to the existing customers.
Having regulatory approval from government basically gives you mass trust and credibility. And the other piece that it provides you with is actually marginalizing the players who are not keeping up to standard, who are risking customer funds. So
I think the word trust is really, really key here. And, just to put a word on it, and at risk of potentially being a little controversial, my opinion is that for Bitcoin to get wide acceptance and trust, it needs to distance itself from what I would describe, for lack of a better word, as anarchism. Right? And I don't mean to use that in an inflammatory way, but there is a piece of the history around it that could be connected that way. And I think that as a pragmatic business person, creating that separation is going to be important for business success. That's what I think as an investor.
So that actually brings us into one of the questions here. What will it take to bring Bitcoin into the mainstream? So I think we answered that a little bit with talking about regulation as far as making the masses more comfortable with it. Any other thoughts as far as bringing it mainstream?
No, I think that's absolutely right. For something to go mainstream, it's got to capture the imagination and the trust of the general population. So it's got to be easy to use, which it's not at the moment. Bitcoin is very, very difficult to use right now. And people have to trust it, especially if it's going to act as a currency. At itBit, we're actually pretty pro-regulation. We would like light touch regulation. We want our customers to be protected in the case of any issues with our own company. You saw there was an exchange base in Tokyo called Mt. Gox that went bankrupt, and all clients who had money assets with them, either sovereign money or Bitcoin, that money didn't belong to the clients. It wasn't held in trust on behalf of the clients because those rules didn't exist. That protection didn't exist. So all of that money was actually company money, which means it's part of the bankruptcy. And I think the customers would be lucky to get 10% of it back. Whereas if we had similar regulations to the current industry and we could hold customer funds in trust, then customers would get their money back first before creditors to a bankruptcy would get their hands on it. And I think that's very, very important for customers to be able to trust the services that they use, such as exchanges and wallets. So for Bitcoin to go mainstream, I think it is regulation, the right kind of regulation, and ease of use.
I would just remind everyone that Bernie Madoff was regulated under SEC, and he was able to, or he managed to steal much more money, or to defraud much more money than Charles Ponzi, who invented this scheme before the SEC and all these regulations existed. So regulation by no means will help. If anything, it will slow down the mainstream adoption and the security and the trust in Bitcoin. What it would take for Bitcoin to be mainstream? Well, us. We need to provide better, easier, safer, more trustworthy services for users, for customers to use them. That then should or continues to introduce more liquidity, which then is reflected in less volatility, which makes it much more useful in daily exchange, in savings, in maybe in the far future in accounting, and then so on and so forth.
So I agree that trust and a community are very important, but I think the fundamental thing that needs to be built out is actually a use case. People don't adopt technology for the sake of technology. They adopt technology because it solves a problem for them. One of the reasons we're excited about emerging markets is because we see a clear use case for Bitcoin. It solves a real pain for people to transfer money to their families, to be able to pay when they don't have a credit card. So building products using Bitcoin around real needs, I think, is what's going to drive adoption into the mass market.
So you guys, you mentioned regulations as kind of solving some of the problems like Mt. Gox, and Tomas countered that with the Madoff example quite well. But there's also the idea that technology can solve some of these problems with things like proof of reserves or other blockchain. If you're hopefully familiar with some of the blockchain technologies. Is there anything coming out on the horizon which will help it go mainstream? Any comments on future developments which technically are going to make it easier for people to use, or technically are going to ensure that an exchange isn't going to go bankrupt?
I think we are seeing both. We are seeing insurance come into Bitcoin. So we're having conversations with insurance companies, big branded insurance companies that everyone in the room's heard of, that are starting to consider how to insure Bitcoins. It's a new problem for them, and they've never had to do it before, and there's only a few cases of things going wrong, and it's a very binary outcome. If you insure a Bitcoin company and they get hacked, they'll probably lose all of their coins. Rather than if you insure a bunch of houses for fire, a few of them will burn down, and you don't have this kind of binary outcome. So it'll probably start off as quite expensive and then get cheaper. And the insurance companies will have to learn how to understand how Bitcoin exchanges and wallets do their security. And there are no standards at the moment. It'd be great if the community could come together and come up with some standards of how to look after Bitcoin. It's such that it's easily understandable by insurers.
And this is a great example, actually. And itBit and others made a great job after Mt. Gox collapse to come forward and to make public statements about how they deal with their security. Some exchanges introduced third-party independent audits to show that they hold 100% or even more than 100% of their reserves in cold storages. And to remind everyone, this was introduced without any regulation in place. Again, it's the urge of the entrepreneurs and of the companies to increase the trust and the goodwill.
Okay. This is actually a very interesting question. And I'm not sure if we're quite qualified to answer it. It comes down to that certain countries have more mining capacity than other countries. When you validate a Bitcoin transaction, it goes through a process of mining, and if any one mining group has more than, let's say, 51%, you could effectively do a double spend. So you could send the Bitcoin to more than one person and cancel this order, and they've already sent you that good, and then create a new blockchain and order it from someone else. Do you guys have any opinions as far as particular countries having control over the mining capability of Bitcoin?
I think we have to tease out the two halves of mining. One is mining to generate Bitcoins in order to, as it says here, to control supply or to mint. One is the minting process of getting new Bitcoins, which makes you in control of Bitcoins. And the other one is mining as a accountancy type role, where you're validating all the Bitcoin transactions that are going on in the kind of ether. I think this question is getting at the supply, so that's the minting of Bitcoin, and I think it is the centralization in a decentralized currency and space. The centralization of mining is a bit of a concern. Recently, we've had one group of miners getting to 47% of the total processing power of the Bitcoin network. And voluntarily, without any regulation, to Thomas's point, people left that group because it was getting too powerful. And should one group get too powerful, then bad things could happen.
I think they even stopped sign-ups for some time in order to lower their own share.
Right. So in terms of the control of supply, yeah, there are groups who are getting more and more Bitcoin. With the ability to sell them, and that is concerning. What's your take on it? Well, I would encourage other countries to get involved to do some mining. I think in Singapore here we have a mining startup which is investing millions of dollars into mining equipment. You got to go where power is cheap because mining is expensive. There's a demand on electricity, but look. China has traditionally created a lot of chips, and it'll continue to make chips. Who uses them is whoever wants to buy the chips and plug them in, really. So I advise other countries to join the party.
Yeah, Antony made a great point at the end, which I wanted to make as well. These are manufacturers. They don't use them. They ultimately just supply someone who orders them and pays for them. So that Israel and China and US manufactures most or almost all of these chips doesn't mean that they also use them, just that they have the best capabilities and technologies and capital to do it. But other countries and companies around the world are actually ordering them and using them.
A lot of these chips are actually manufactured in Singapore as well, and they're exported to China for assembly. Okay. So another interesting question here. Just answer this one and move on. Is the paradox of Bitcoin. People are aware of it, people hold it, and a lot of people aren't spending them yet. I think that they meant fiat currency instead of Bitcoin. So your opinion on why people are holding their Bitcoin instead of spending them?
Because it's easier to spend fiat.
So it's just a catch-22 of not enough merchants at this point?
No, I mean, a lot of these people hold Bitcoin in the West. They have credit cards. There are credit cards on file on Amazon. You want to buy something online, it takes 2 seconds. It's one click. You're at the store. It's one swipe. So the incremental benefit of using Bitcoin versus a credit card to finish a commerce transaction is just not high enough.
I would oppose it. Yesterday I was ordering some hardware from Tiger Direct, and I beat Bitcoin outright because I find it much easier just to pull out my smartphone, scan the QR code, and press one button than to type in credit card number or something that just and having to give away my private key, which is my credit card number, to the merchant. I just prefer to use Bitcoin because it's much safer and quicker. It's also about marginal utility, and which depends on how much net worth people hold in Bitcoin versus fiat. Vast majority of people still have vast majority of their savings in, or if they have any savings, in fiat. So they prefer to spend those because if they have $1,000 worth of Bitcoin or $100,000 worth of Bitcoin, they will not spend a couple hundred of them. If that changes, if they will slowly and eventually realize that their fiat savings are losing money while their Bitcoin savings are gaining purchasing power, they will or they should increase their Bitcoin savings and have much more wealth in Bitcoin, and then they will start spending that as the portion they are supposed or about to spend in Bitcoin is much smaller compared to their Bitcoin wealth overall.
I'd just like to add that we're still right at the very, very beginning of Bitcoin. Like, adoption takes time. It's going to take 5-10 years to do. And as you say, it is very hard to spend Bitcoin. I went to London. I made a pilgrimage to the 5 or 6 pubs that accept Bitcoin in Shoreditch, and the Wi-Fi was down, so I couldn't. So I handed over cash instead, but I begged them to plug in their Wi-Fi. It's just hard to do. And Thomas, people are developing solutions, both online and offline solutions for point of sale, where to make it easy for consumers to spend Bitcoin, and I do whenever I can. It's a great party trick to show to my friends. Looking at who's sponsoring this, Airbnb, I would conjecture that a lot of people who have heard of Airbnb are still using hotels, and maybe they've used Airbnb once or twice, but they're still mainly using hotels. Most people who've heard of Uber, most people have heard of Uber now, in the kind of countries we're talking about. They're still flagging down taxis, so it's not binary. It takes time. It takes time and comfort and ease, as we mentioned earlier on, and I think that's why we're still paying with Sovereign.
Yeah, I mean, in '95, I didn't use the internet to send messages to my friends either. I picked up the phone, right? It was a lot of friction. 5-10 years later, I would never imagine picking up the phone. I only use the messenger. So I think the future of payment and the future of money is definitely digital. But it's going to take time to reduce that friction. At the moment, people are just going to reach into the thing that's easiest to use.
Okay, so we should talk a little bit then about the volatility of Bitcoin. So we got a question here. How can a business deal with this sort of volatility? You want to accept Bitcoin, but you have to deal with the fact that the price fluctuates.
They shouldn't. So, I mean, Bitcoin is just like foreign currency, right? So we actually do merchant acceptance for 2 of the largest e-commerce sites in the Philippines. They never see Bitcoin. They care about pesos. They pay their suppliers in pesos. We hedge the foreign currency risk. And I think it's just the same as if you have a website, you accept credit cards, and your customer might be paying their credit card bill in euros. You get local currency to you. So.
Yeah, but the fluctuations between euros and whatever is maybe 2% on a really rough day, whereas Bitcoin, we're kind of comfortable with a 25% swing day on day, right? So I'm not sure how valid that argument is, but what I would say is there are companies in some countries that are doing the opposite of what you're doing. So they're billing in local currencies, and they're getting their Bitcoin payment processors to convert it into Bitcoin so that they can hold the Bitcoin instead of their local currency. Now, call them speculators, call it a defensive move. I think BitPagos in Argentina actually does that. So they go both ways. Some companies want their customers to be able to pay by Bitcoin, but they want to receive sovereign. Some people want their customers to be able to pay by whatever method they want, and they want to hold Bitcoin in the end.
They do this by the way because their currency is even more volatile than Bitcoin.
It's not. It's really not. Argentinian peso has lost half its value in 3.5 years. That's how volatile it is. That's not volatile compared to Bitcoin. Bitcoin can lose half its value in less than a week.
Yeah, but the difference is that peso and all of these screwed up currencies, and even those currencies which are considered fairly stable, are much less volatile, but they are much less volatile downwards, while Bitcoin on average is volatile upwards. Remember what it was worth a year ago, let alone 2 years ago. But one thing that needs to be added is the volatility is actually going down. When you compare the volatility to a few months ago or to a year ago, it is much smaller these days. You can see days when quite often, most of the days in the last month, when the daily volatility is less than 1%, which of course is still a lot for unit of account, but it is much less than it was months ago. And this is exactly what we've been predicting for a long time, that the more liquidity there will be, the more people will hold it, exchange it, save it, the more stable it gets, because there will be always stop gaps up and down.
Yeah, just a little further on the volatility point. I mean, echoing exactly the same thing. I think if the volatility were comparable to a currency, there'd be no issue whatsoever. I think the other thing that's worth keeping in mind is that if you look at the retail fee structure of something like a credit card purchase cross-currency, you're paying much more in fees than you would lose due to an adverse move with volatile anything in most cases, unless it is truly very volatile. Yeah.
Well, part of the reason that credit cards are so expensive to use to the merchant, 3.5% sometimes, you may pay another 3.5% on foreign exchange, is because they have security and insurance built into the system. I just ordered some hotel room for Hong Kong online, and I used my credit card because it's insured. And it also includes travel insurance and things like that. So as we add these things to Bitcoin, are we going to be increasing the cost of Bitcoin? And also maybe talk a little bit about the security that's being added to Bitcoin.
Yeah, but the important portion of the insurance of Bitcoin transaction is the fact that when you give a merchant your credit card, you give him your private key. So essentially you allow him to spend the credit on the credit card, which is not the case of Bitcoin. So for this, the consumers need to have a protection. They need to have a possibility of the chargeback, and the financial institutions backing these transactions need to have insurance to deal with these things. This is taken out of the equation with Bitcoin completely, and I'm not an expert on this. I have to admit, maybe you know more about this, but I think this is the largest portion of the insurance costs in credit card transactions. So if this is taken out of the way with Bitcoin, then we're dealing with much smaller costs overall.
So maybe we could talk a little bit, we don't have much time, a couple of minutes, about security and fraud protection. What's available with Bitcoin now, what's coming out in the future?
Oh gosh, I think we have to tease this apart again. So we've got the security and fraud protection regarding Bitcoin transactions, which I think Tomas has talked about. With the credit card, you're giving away all the details you need for someone else to steal your credit limit. Whereas with Bitcoin, you push. So that's why a credit card's called a pull transaction. The merchant pulls however much he needs out of your credit limit. Whereas with Bitcoins, it's more of a push transaction where it's like getting notes out of my pocket and handing it over. And I don't give away any of my secrets. I cryptographically sign the transaction, but I don't give away any of my passwords or secrets for a third party who's kind of sniffing the transaction to see, to take and then clone my Bitcoin address. Something. I think what this question may be getting at is security of Bitcoin companies. So now we're starting to talk about Bitcoin companies acting as custodians or banks for other people. We hold funds of our clients, and we need to start dealing with. Well, we already deal with security and fraud prevention there, and I think we at the moment there's no industry standard, but as we see insurance companies come on and start demanding things, I think there will be an emergence of standards. We do our own security. We don't keep any Bitcoins online. We keep it all offline, and there are various stages. There are various things that need to happen with various people in our company before we can make transactions out of our wallets into other people's wallets. But it's the same challenges that banks have with fraud prevention. How do you confirm that someone is who they say they are when they want to withdraw money, and those kinds of things? So same challenges as banks, possibly slightly different ways of dealing with it. But it's tricky and it's expensive to get right. But I think you will see an emergence of standards, and we will get it right.
Okay, great. Quick.
Sure. I mean, I think the set of technologies that are needed to secure Bitcoin are already out there because the banking industry has developed them over the last several decades. things like multi-signature are coming out. It's just going to take time, 6 to 12 months to productize, to get it to a point where it's consumer ready. And I think we're going to see this coming very soon.
Last quick, you wanted to say something quick? Oh yeah, so anyone who's interested, we're going to be having a meetup tomorrow night at Oyster Bar for the Bitcoin community here in Singapore. So of course you're all welcome. Oyster Bar, I believe, is going to be taking Bitcoin as well for payments. So if you have some Bitcoin and you want to spend them,
They do take Bitcoin in their daily operations, so they will, of course, tomorrow as well. Go to meetup.com/Bitcoin Singapore for details.
okay, great. And I'd like to thank everyone for taking part of the panel here. Thank you very much.